class. I thought I would take about 10 minutes, we'll see, give or take, to walk you through some of the basics of moral arguments. First things first. Is morality subjective or relative? No. Very few professional ethicists, professional philosophers, professional moral theorists think this. Non-professionals might think this, but there are very few good reasons in its favor. In fact, there are plenty of reasons to think morality is objective. That doesn't mean it's easy, doesn't mean we all know the answers, but of course, I think we think science is objective, and I don't think we think scientists know all the answers or that science is easy. It's just morality is different. It's hard. For starters, we give moral arguments. We tend not to give arguments for things if we don't think there's a right answer. If I said Ben & Jerry's and New York Super Fudge Chunk is the best ice cream on the planet, and you said, okay, Professor Horton, give me your reasons. I mean, I taste it, I like it. Isn't that the end of it, right? I'm not really giving an argument that it's objectively the best. I'm just telling you why I like it. But we don't do that with moral claims. Professor Horton, why do you think murder's wrong? I don't really like murder. That doesn't seem to be a very good argument, right? But we say things like, oh, it involves the loss of an innocent human life. Or we say things like, it made the world objectively worse with no positive net return, or whatever we might say, depending on what our views are. So we do give moral arguments. We also ask for reasons. If someone were to say, I believe torture is wrong, we might say, why do you think that? And we would expect some reason beyond someone just saying, I don't like it. Or that's the way I was raised. And we also think people can be mistaken about moral claims. I think we think that if someone were to tell you that they believe murder is okay, I think we would think they've made an error in judgment. Wouldn't we stop being friends with them? We might stop trusting them around our children if they genuinely believed that murder was okay. I think we think they've made an error. And if we think they've made an error, it must be because we think there's a right answer. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't hard moral issues. Of course there are. But by and large, we agree on most of them. We agree that lying is typically wrong, and we agree that murder's wrong, and we agree you shouldn't harm children, and so on. But we agree on the easy stuff. It's the hard stuff that gets the most press. And I think that's why there might be this mistaken view that ethics is all a matter of opinion, or that ethics is all subjective or relative. It ain't. So in this chapter, we're going to look at how to make a moral argument and how to evaluate a moral argument. The way we're going to look at moral arguments is a simplified view of moral arguments. For us, a moral argument will have one or more premises and a conclusion, and that conclusion will be a moral statement. So it'll be a statement, because we have to deal with things that can be true or false, and statements are those things. But it'll be a moral statement. It'll be asserting that some action is right or wrong, or that something is good or bad, or that this action is just, or this institution is unjust. So here are some examples. If I say Tim ought to save Sue from drowning, that's a moral claim about what Tim ought to do. If I say lying is immoral, that's a moral claim about the status of lying. And if I were to say Audrey's a bad person, that's a moral claim about Audrey's character. Non-moral statements simply describe the world without ascribing a value to it. If I say that your action of pushing a knife forward resulted in the harm of the person standing next to you, I've simply described a case. But if I then go on to add, oh, and by the way, your causing harm to that person was immoral, well, now I've evaluated it negatively. The first claim was purely descriptive. You moved a knife like this, and that caused an effect, namely harm in this other person. Purely descriptive, cause and effect kind of claim. But if I evaluate it and say, that was bad, or you shouldn't have done that, that's a moral claim. And moral arguments will consist of both kinds of claims. They're usually a mixture. So here's an example. It is wrong to cause unnecessary harm. Punching Bob in the face causes unnecessary harm, therefore punching Bob in the face is wrong. This is a moral argument. And as you can see, premise A is the moral premise. It tells you when something is wrong, if it causes unnecessary harm. Premise B is a descriptive claim. It just says punching Bob in the face causes unnecessary harm. That's a description. That is not an evaluation. That just tells you if you punch Bob in the face, it's going to cause harm, and that harm is not necessary to save Bob's life or to make the world a better place or something. And the conclusion, C, puts those two claims together to infer a new claim, namely, punching Bob in the face is wrong. Standard moral argument. And then we can evaluate this argument to see whether it is good or bad. Sometimes a moral premise is suppressed, and I have a practice quiz in Blackboard that will help you find a suppressed or missing premise inside a moral argument. So I would encourage you to work through that quiz. It's not for a grade, you'll see it in this week's module, but it will help you get a handle on supplying the missing moral premise. Here's just an example. Spanking inflicts unnecessary pain on a child, someone might say. Therefore, spanking is wrong. Well, you'll notice there's a conclusion, spanking is wrong. And then there's the claim, spanking inflicts unnecessary pain on a child. That's a factual claim though, right? That's just a description. Well, we need a moral premise to connect up with that factual claim so that we can then infer the moral claim that's the conclusion. So maybe our moral premise is causing unnecessary pain is wrong. Here's another example, just real quick. Torturing prisoners of war is a case of intentional mistreatment. Therefore, prisoners of war should not be tortured. What's missing there? It's a moral premise, right? The moral premise that's missing is you should not intentionally mistreat someone, right? Good. Sometimes the non-moral or the descriptive premise is missing. So someone might say, well, murder's wrong, therefore abortion's wrong. Well, you have a moral premise and a moral conclusion, so what's wrong? Well, you need a factual claim to connect murder and abortion. So someone might claim that abortion is murder. That's the factual claim that's missing, right? Abortion is the kind of act that falls under this category. And we would then evaluate that factual claim to see whether it's true or false. We can also evaluate the moral claim that murder is always wrong to see whether it's true or false. So I'm not endorsing any of these arguments. They're just examples. Well, how do we evaluate a moral argument? Well, it's not merely a matter of opinion. There are objective ways to do it, and we evaluate arguments the same way we always have. We ask two questions. 1, do their conclusions follow from their premises? Is the logic good? Did the person reason well with the information they started with? And the second question we ask is the information they started with true? Are the moral premises used in their arguments good? And are the factual claims they use in their arguments good? Pretty straightforward. So let's determine whether a moral premise is true or false by looking at 3 ways. We can do this by comparing them to other moral principles. We can compare them to moral theories. And we're not going to do too much of that theory work. That's a work you might get, at least at Harper, in PHI 115, Philosophy 115, which is our Introduction to Ethics course. Plenty of theory and applied theory there. But you can also look at what are called considered moral judgments. These are things we have really good reason to believe independent of any theory. So no matter what theory you have, for instance, I think we think racism is wrong. Like, you don't need to be a utilitarian or a Kantian or a whatever to think that discrimination on the basis of race is wrong. That seems pretty straightforward. And if your theory doesn't get that right, that would seem to be a problem for your theory. So that's a considered moral judgment we have about racism. We think it's wrong, and we have good reasons for that. So it's not just a belief we pulled out of the thin air. Well, let's do some of these. First, you might look at moral principles. I just give you 4. There are lots of moral principles, but these seem pretty intuitive. A principle of harm often says, do not harm others unnecessarily. You have to have that word unnecessarily there, right? If your moral principle were never cause harm, then you couldn't get surgery if you needed surgery to fix your appendix, because that surgery would cause harm to your body. But obviously you need to cause the short-term harm to your body of the incision in order to have the long-term gain of not dying with a ruptured appendix. You might have a principle of benevolence, which says, help those in need, or try to do the thing that makes the world a better place. That's a pretty solid principle. Why shouldn't you litter? Because it makes the world worse, that's why. Like, it's a pretty straightforward, seemingly pretty clear argument, right? And if someone is drowning and you have a life preserver, I think we think you have an obligation to throw them the life preserver. It seems pretty straightforward. How these work in controversial cases is different, but these principles are pretty clear. There are principles of justice about rights and due process. And we can also talk about individual rights. We can talk about a right to life, or a right to information, or a right to privacy, which is a big topic these days, given big tech and big data, such as Amazon or Google, or the alphabet company that umbrellas Google. We can talk about rights to free expression. Lots of individual rights come up. And these are powerful, right? The bigger the principle, the more plausible your argument is. If I say, you shouldn't do that because I don't like it, and then if I say, you shouldn't do that because it violates a right of mine, I think you can see that second argument is much more convincing than the first. because it appeals to a right and not just an individual preference. You can appeal to moral theories to support your views. If your view is in accordance with a plausible moral theory, that's pretty good for your view. Now, not every moral theory is equal. Some are bad and some are good. And of course, we haven't solved the problem of what's the absolutely true correct moral theory yet. Ethicists and philosophers are working on it, I'm sure, but some are definitely more plausible than others. And if you can hitch yours up to a fairly plausible moral theory, that does give you a little weight in your argument. So that's a good thing. And we can also appeal to considered moral judgments. If your view implies that racism is okay, that would seem to be a problem for your view, no matter what your view is. In the same way, if you're a scientist and your view implies that the earth is flat, that's a problem for your scientific theory, because we have pretty good reasons that the earth is somewhat spherical. And those are reasons independent of whether you're a Newtonian about physics or an Einsteinian about physics or whatever. Considered moral judgments. And these are not infallible, right? We can be wrong. We have to admit that we can be wrong. So let's look at an example of an argument. Example 1. The medical cloning of humans is unnatural because it is something that would not occur without human intervention. Premise 2. All actions that are unnatural and that are not done for religious reasons should not be done, right? They're immoral. Premise 3. The medical cloning of humans is never done for religious reasons. Therefore, 4. Cloning should not be done. What do we think of this argument? Well, we've got some moral premises and non-moral premises. By that I mean factual claims. Number 3 is a factual claim, right? The medical cloning of humans is never done for religious reasons. That just describes the conditions under which medical cloning is done. Maybe it is or maybe it isn't done for religious reasons, but at least I, Michael Horton, don't know of any religion that preaches that we ought to be cloning humans, so that seems pretty plausible. 2 is a moral claim. It says any action that's unnatural and not done for religious reasons, right? They make an exception, right? Because it could be something as religiously protected, but otherwise would be immoral. But if an action is unnatural and not done for religious reasons, it should not be done, claims premise 2. And premise 1 says the medical cloning of humans is unnatural because it's something that would not occur without human intervention. And I think the logic of this argument is good. Like the conclusion, 4, follows from 1 and 2 and 3 put together. That seems pretty straightforward, right? If cloning is unnatural and a natural thing should not be done, then cloning should not be done because it's not done for religious reasons, and that was the only exception our principle made. Seems pretty straightforward. But just because the logic is good, is it a good argument? We have to ask our second question. Are the premises plausible? And the answer here is no, right? That first premise is not very plausible at all. Premise 2 is not really plausible, I should say. All actions that are unnatural and that are not done for religious reasons should not be done. But I think we can easily find examples of things that are, quote, unnatural according to this definition, which are totally okay. Right? So according to this argument, premise 1 says something's unnatural when it would not occur without human intervention. Can we imagine something that would not occur without human intervention that's totally okay? How about damming a river for electricity? Is that immoral? How about the particular form of aspirin that we take? I know aspirin can be found to occur naturally, but not in the form in which we take it, right? It's undergone pretty extensive chemical work to get that form. Many surgeries are the kinds of things that can save lives, but they wouldn't occur without human intervention. So I think we could say that the premise 2 is not very plausible. It seems to say that all these things are immoral that we have pretty good reason for thinking are good, right? We think surgery is good. And we might not think that every single river dammed in the history of the world is a good thing, but I think we think some of them are, right? Surely cheap power is pretty good, and if we can get it, we can get it, at least in some situations. So I suspect we might have a problem with that second premise. And what we did there was look for counterexamples to a moral premise. If someone presents a moral claim that's a generality, that's meant to be a principle, one way of seeing whether it's plausible is to look for cases that either fit it or don't, and to see how plausible they might be. If someone says it's always wrong to do anything that's unnatural, and by unnatural I mean things that require human intervention, you might say, well, how about treating cancer? How about, right, you're going to start coming up with examples that fit or don't fit that principle. And if the examples that don't fit it are fairly plausible, I think we're going to regard that principle as not very good. That's to look for counterexamples. So a quick review. A moral claim is not a descriptive claim. It's often a claim with an ought or a should. It's a value judgment. And we can support value judgments by appealing to other value judgments that are well supported: principles, moral theories, and considered moral judgments. We can determine whether a moral premise is true or false, then, we might say, by examining the support it gets from moral principles. The more plausible your moral principle, the more plausible your argument, other moral theories, and considered moral judgments. So as we work, let's be careful to evaluate our own arguments and present arguments of our own that are carefully constructed and that fit our patterns. They have a moral premise, a non-moral premise, and a moral conclusion. We should never say things like, "Who are you to say?" or "It depends on how you were raised," or "But people break that rule all the time." Fine. But a moral argument has everything we need in the argument to evaluate it. It's got premises, and the person who put the argument forward used logic or reason, and we want to know whether they used logic or reason well, and whether their premises are plausible. And that's all we need to evaluate moral arguments, the same as any other argument. Thank you for spending some time with me. I look forward to discussing moral arguments and some of the examples with you in the discussion forum.